behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where tradition rules with an iron fist and every word is carefully measured, something unprecedented was happening. The new king, barely settled into his throne, was making a decision so shocking that even the most seasoned royal insiders couldn't believe what they were witnessing. For decades, Camilla had waited in the shadows, enduring public criticism and media storms, always believing that one day her family would finally be embraced by the crown. She had sacrificed everything for love, weathered countless scandals, and stood by Charles through his darkest hours. But now, as queen consort, she was about to discover that even reaching the pinnacle of royal power couldn't guarantee the one thing she wanted most: acceptance for those she loved. What Charles did next would leave palace staff speechless, send shockwaves through the Commonwealth, and prove that sometimes, even love has its limits when duty calls. This is the story of a decision that would forever change the royal family, told through the eyes of those who witnessed it all unfold. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Clarence House as Camilla Parker Bowles, now queen consort, stood at her private study window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the roses. It had been 3 months since Charles ascended to the throne, 3 months since her life changed forever, and 3 months since she began hoping for something she had dreamed about for decades. In her hands, she held a carefully crafted letter, written in her own elegant script on the finest palace stationery. The letter contained a simple request, yet one that meant the world to her. She wanted her family, her children Tom and Laura, her grandchildren, and even her ex-husband Andrew to be given proper recognition and roles within the royal fold. After years of being kept at arm's length, she believed that her position as queen consort would finally open doors that had remained firmly closed. Camilla's journey to this moment had been anything but smooth. She remembered the early days when she was vilified by the press, called the woman who destroyed a fairy tale marriage. The public had been merciless, and the royal establishment even more so. She had endured years of careful public rehabilitation, slowly winning over hearts and minds through charitable work and quiet dignity. She had proven her loyalty to Charles time and again, standing by him through constitutional crises, family scandals, and personal struggles. Her son Tom Parker Bowles had built a successful career as a food writer and critic, deliberately staying away from royal circles to avoid controversy. Her daughter Laura Lopez had married well and maintained a low profile, raising her children away from the spotlight that seemed to follow everything connected to the royal family. Both had suffered because of their mother's relationship with Charles, facing scrutiny and sometimes harsh judgment from the public and media. The queen consort's mind drifted to her grandchildren, innocent young souls who barely understood why their grandmother lived in a palace, but they couldn't visit freely like other children visited their grandparents. She thought about the family gatherings that had to be carefully orchestrated, the birthday parties that required security clearances, and the simple family moments that had become complicated diplomatic exercises. Andrew Parker Bowles, her former husband, had maintained a dignified silence throughout the years. Despite their divorce, he had remained a gentleman, never speaking poorly of Camilla or Charles in public. He had even attended their wedding, showing a level of grace that impressed even the most cynical royal watchers. Camilla believed that such dignity deserved recognition, and that perhaps it was time for the royal family to embrace a more modern, inclusive approach to family relationships. As she prepared for her morning meetings, Camilla reflected on the conversations she had been having with Charles about the future of the monarchy. He had spoken passionately about modernizing the institution, making it more relevant to contemporary Britain. She saw an opportunity to put these words into action by integrating her family into royal life in meaningful ways. Perhaps Tom could take on patronages related to food and culture, or Laura could become involved with children's charities. Even Andrew, with his military background, could contribute to veteran causes. The palace staff had noticed a change in the queen consort's demeanor since the coronation. She carried herself with new confidence, speaking more assertively in meetings and offering suggestions that went beyond traditional ceremonial duties. She had waited so long for this moment, and she wasn't going to waste it by remaining in the shadows. Her private secretary, Margaret Thornton, entered the study with the morning's correspondence and schedule. Margaret had served the royal family for over 20 years and had witnessed the gradual acceptance of Camilla within palace circles. She had watched as staff members who were initially skeptical came to respect and even admire the woman who had become queen consort. Margaret placed the letters on Camilla's desk and noticed the handwritten note her boss had been holding. Without saying anything, she understood that this was an important moment. The queen consort had confided in her about her hopes for her family's future, and Margaret had watched as those hopes grew stronger with each passing day since the coronation. The conversation that morning centered around upcoming state visits and ceremonial duties, but Camilla's mind kept returning to her letter. She had spent weeks crafting the perfect words, explaining her vision for how her family could serve the crown while maintaining their individual identities. She had researched historical precedents, looking at how other royal families had integrated stepfamilies and non-traditional relationships into their official structures. As the morning progressed, Camilla made her rounds through the palace, attending meetings with charity representatives and reviewing plans for upcoming engagements. At each stop, she found herself observing how the royal machinery worked, how decisions were made, and how traditions were both honored and adapted. She began to see pathways for her family's integration that would benefit everyone involved. The lunch hour brought a moment of quiet reflection. Camilla often used this time to call her children, maintaining the close relationships that had sustained her through difficult years. Today's conversation with Tom was particularly meaningful. He had been working on a new cookbook and mentioned how honored he would be to contribute to royal events featuring British cuisine. Laura shared news about her children's school activities and mentioned how proud they were of their grandmother's new role. These conversations strengthened Camilla's resolve. Her family deserved to be part of her new life, not hidden away like embarrassing secrets. They were good people who had proven their worth and their discretion. They understood the responsibilities that came with royal connections and were prepared to embrace them fully. The afternoon brought meetings with senior palace officials about planning for the upcoming Christmas celebrations. As they discussed guest lists and protocol, Camilla found herself imagining how different these conversations might be if her family were officially recognized. She pictured Tom helping to plan menus that showcased British culinary traditions, Laura organizing activities for the younger royal children, and Andrew adding his perspective to discussions about military honors and veteran affairs. As evening approached, Camilla returned to her private quarters to prepare for dinner with Charles. This would be the perfect opportunity to present her proposal, to share her carefully considered plan for bringing her family into the royal fold. She had chosen this timing deliberately, knowing that Charles was in good spirits following successful meetings with Commonwealth representatives earlier in the day. The queen consort changed into one of Charles's favorite evening dresses, a deep blue silk that complemented her complexion beautifully. She took extra care with her appearance, understanding the importance of presentation in royal life. Everything mattered, from the way she looked to the tone of her voice to the timing of her request. As she made final preparations, Camilla allowed herself a moment of optimism. Charles loved her, of that she had no doubt. He had proven it by marrying her despite enormous opposition and by making her queen consort despite constitutional complications. Surely he would understand her desire to bring her family closer, to create a more complete life that included all the people who mattered to her. The palace corridors seemed different as she walked toward the private dining room. The portraits of previous monarchs looked down at her with expressions that seemed less stern than usual. The grandfather clocks chimed 7 o'clock, marking not just the dinner hour but what felt like a pivotal moment in her life as queen consort. Charles was already waiting, looking distinguished in his evening wear, reading through official papers, as was his habit. He looked up with genuine warmth when she entered, setting aside his work to focus entirely on her. This was one of the qualities she loved most about him, his ability to be completely present when they were together, despite the enormous pressures of his new role as king. Their conversation began with the usual exchange about the day's activities, sharing stories and observations about their respective meetings and engagements. Camilla waited for the right moment, letting the conversation flow naturally while building up her courage for what she knew would be a crucial discussion. As dessert was served, she finally reached for her letter, her heart beating faster as she prepared to share her deepest hopes with the man she loved. Charles looked up from his dessert as Camilla placed the cream-colored envelope beside his coffee cup. The elegant handwriting immediately caught his attention, and he recognized the careful thought that had gone into its presentation. As king, he had become accustomed to receiving countless letters and petitions, but this felt different. This felt personal and significant. He opened the letter with the deliberate care he applied to all important documents, his eyes scanning the words while his expression remained carefully neutral. Years of diplomatic training had taught him to control his reactions, but Camilla knew him well enough to notice the slight tension that appeared around his eyes as he read. The letter was beautifully written, filled with love and hope. Camilla had outlined her vision for how her family could serve the crown, detailing specific roles and responsibilities that would benefit both the monarchy and the people they served. She had researched historical precedents and found examples of how other European royal families had successfully integrated complex family structures into their official duties. Charles set the letter down gently, his fingers tracing its edges as he considered his response. The silence stretched between them, heavy with expectation and unspoken concerns. Camilla watched his face, searching for signs of approval or understanding, but finding instead the mask of careful consideration that he wore during the most difficult royal decisions. Finally, Charles spoke, his voice measured and thoughtful. He acknowledged the love behind her request and expressed his understanding of her desire to include her family in their new life. But then came the words that would change everything. He explained, with the patience of someone who had spent decades navigating royal protocol, why her request was impossible. The monarchy, he reminded her gently, was built on centuries of tradition and careful precedent. Every decision had to consider not just personal desires but constitutional implications, public perception, and the long-term stability of the institution. Bringing Camilla's family into official royal roles would raise questions about succession, create new constitutional complications, and potentially undermine the very foundations of the crown's authority. Charles had been preparing for this conversation longer than Camilla realized. His advisors had anticipated this request and had prepared detailed briefings on why it could not be granted. The constitutional experts had been clear in their assessment. The historic precedents that Camilla had researched were from different eras, with different constitutional frameworks and social expectations. Modern monarchy required even more careful consideration of public opinion and democratic principles. The king explained the delicate balance he had to maintain between his personal happiness and his duty to the crown. His marriage to Camilla had already tested the limits of public acceptance and constitutional flexibility. To push further, to grant official roles to her family, would risk undermining the carefully rebuilt trust between the monarchy and the British people. He spoke about the years of preparation that had gone into making their marriage acceptable to the public and the establishment. The careful campaigns to rehabilitate Camilla's image, the gradual introduction of her into royal duties, the patient work of proving that their relationship strengthened rather than weakened the monarchy. All of this progress could be undone by moving too quickly or pushing too hard for additional changes. The conversation grew more intense as Camilla pressed her case. She reminded Charles of his own words about modernizing the monarchy, about making it more relevant and inclusive. She pointed out the contributions her family could make, their proven loyalty and discretion, their willingness to serve. Her voice carried a note of desperation that cut through the formal atmosphere of their discussion. Charles felt the weight of every word. He loved Camilla deeply and wanted to give her everything she desired. He understood her longing to have her complete family recognized and honored. But he also understood the brutal realities of constitutional monarchy in the 21st century. Every decision was scrutinized, every change was debated, and every precedent created lasting consequences. The king's advisors had painted a stark picture of what could happen if he granted Camilla's request. Opposition politicians would question the expansion of royal privilege at a time when many called for reducing the monarchy's role. The media would dissect every aspect of her family's backgrounds, potentially uncovering embarrassing details that could damage the crown's reputation. Public opinion, still fragile regarding Camilla's role, could turn decisively negative. As the evening progressed, Charles found himself walking a tightrope between love and duty that felt impossibly narrow. He looked across the table at his wife, seeing the hope and vulnerability in her eyes, and felt his heart break. This was the woman who had sacrificed everything for their love, who had endured decades of criticism and scrutiny, who had proven her worth time and again. She deserved to have her family honored and recognized. But he also thought about his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and the lessons she had taught him about duty and sacrifice. She had shown him that being a monarch sometimes meant making decisions that broke your heart for the greater good of the institution and the nation. Personal happiness, no matter how deeply felt, could never supersede constitutional responsibility. The discussion continued late into the night, moving from the formal dining room to Charles's private study. Maps of the Commonwealth lined the walls, and portraits of previous monarchs seemed to watch their conversation with stern disapproval. The weight of history pressed down on every word, every argument, every plea. Camilla grew more emotional as the evening wore on. Years of contained hope and suppressed desires came pouring out. She spoke about the loneliness of watching her family remain on the sidelines while she stepped into the most prominent role in the nation. She described the pain of seeing her grandchildren treated as outsiders to a family they barely understood. She begged Charles to consider that love and loyalty should count for more than ancient protocols. Charles listened with growing anguish, torn between his roles as husband and king. He tried to explain the complex web of relationships and expectations that governed every royal decision. Parliament, the Commonwealth realms, the established church, public opinion, constitutional lawyers, historical precedent, all these factors had to be considered and balanced. Personal desires, no matter how justified, could not override these fundamental considerations. As midnight approached, the conversation reached a crucial turning point. Charles made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than giving a final answer immediately, he proposed a compromise that he hoped might satisfy both his love for Camilla and his duty to the crown. He suggested a gradual, unofficial integration of her family into certain royal activities, carefully managed and limited in scope. Perhaps Tom could attend some state dinners as a guest rather than in an official capacity. Maybe Laura could participate in certain charity events without formal patronages. Andrew could be invited to military ceremonies as a distinguished guest rather than as a family member. These small gestures might acknowledge Camilla's family without creating constitutional complications. But even as he made this suggestion, Charles could see that it wasn't enough for Camilla. She had hoped for something much more significant, a real integration that would make her family feel truly part of the royal structure. The compromise felt like another form of exclusion, dressed up in prettier language, but ultimately maintaining the same barriers that had existed for years. The evening ended with no resolution, just a promise to continue the discussion after they had both had time to consider all the implications. Charles retired to his chambers feeling the full weight of his crown, understanding more clearly than ever the price of monarchy. Camilla returned to her rooms with her letter in hand, the words that had seemed so hopeful now feeling like evidence of naive optimism. As the palace settled into quiet, staff members who had noticed the extended private meeting began to whisper among themselves. Something significant was happening, something that could affect them all. The carefully maintained balance of royal life was being tested, and no one knew what the outcome might be. In his private study, Charles sat alone among the symbols of centuries of royal tradition, contemplating a decision that would define his early reign and his marriage. The crown that had brought him ultimate power felt heavier than ever as he wrestled with a choice between love and duty that seemed to have no perfect answer. The next morning brought no relief to the tension that had settled over the royal household. Charles awoke before dawn, as was his habit, but instead of his usual review of state papers, he found himself staring out at the London skyline, wrestling with thoughts that had kept him restless throughout the night. The weight of the crown seemed more tangible than ever as he contemplated a decision that would affect not just his marriage, but the very nature of his reign. His private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, arrived precisely at 7 with the morning briefings, but immediately sensed the gravity of the king's mood. After decades of royal service, Sir Clive had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the emotional temperature of the palace, and this morning felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of impending change that made even the most routine tasks feel charged with significance. Charles requested an immediate meeting with his constitutional advisors, a group of distinguished legal experts, historians, and political analysts who helped navigate the complex relationship between monarchy and democracy in modern Britain. These were the people who understood the intricate web of laws, traditions, and expectations that governed every royal decision. If anyone could find a path forward, it would be them. The meeting convened in the palace's Oak Room, a wood-paneled chamber that had hosted countless crucial decisions throughout British history. Around the polished mahogany table sat some of the most brilliant minds in constitutional law, each bringing decades of experience in royal matters. The atmosphere was formal but tense, as everyone understood they were about to discuss something that could reshape the monarchy. Charles presented Camilla's request with careful objectivity, outlining her desire to integrate her family into official royal roles while acknowledging the potential complications. He watched the faces around the table as he spoke, noting the subtle exchanges of glances, the careful note-taking, and the measured expressions that revealed nothing while suggesting everything. The constitutional expert, Professor Dame Margaret Whitfield, spoke first. Her analysis was thorough and devastating. She explained that granting official roles to Camilla's family would create unprecedented constitutional questions about the nature of royal service and succession. If the queen consort's children received formal recognition, what about the children of future consorts? Where would the line be drawn? And who would have the authority to draw it? Sir James Hartwell, the historical advisor, provided context from previous monarchs who had faced similar dilemmas. He cited examples of kings who had been forced to choose between personal desires and constitutional requirements, noting that those who chose personal interests over institutional stability often faced serious consequences. The monarchy's survival, he argued, depended on maintaining clear boundaries between private family and public service. The political advisor, Lord Pemberton, painted an even starker picture. Public opinion polling showed that while Camilla had gained acceptance as queen consort, there remained significant skepticism about expanding royal privileges. In an era of economic uncertainty and growing Republican sentiment, any perception of the monarchy becoming more inclusive of personal relationships rather than less could trigger a constitutional crisis. As the meeting progressed, Charles felt his options narrowing. Every angle of analysis pointed toward the same conclusion. Granting Camilla's request would be not just inadvisable, but potentially catastrophic for the monarchy's future. The experts weren't being needlessly conservative. They were protecting an institution that had survived for over 1,000 years by carefully managing change and respecting constitutional limits. The conversation turned to potential compromises, echoing some of the ideas Charles had proposed to Camilla the previous evening. Could her family be included in private royal events without official recognition? Could they be given ceremonial roles without constitutional authority? Each suggestion was carefully examined and ultimately found wanting. Any official recognition, no matter how limited, would cross constitutional lines that had been carefully maintained for generations. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, the youngest member of the advisory group and an expert in modern constitutional theory, offered a perspective that particularly resonated with Charles. She argued that the monarchy's relevance in the 21st century depended not on expanding its reach, but on demonstrating restraint and wisdom. The public needed to see that the crown understood its proper role in a democratic society and wouldn't abuse its position for personal benefit. The meeting concluded with a unanimous recommendation that Charles could not have wanted to hear but had expected nonetheless. The constitutional advisors were clear. Camilla's request could not be granted without risking serious damage to the monarchy's constitutional position and public standing. The king would have to choose between his wife's happiness and his duty to the crown, and there was no middle ground that satisfied both. As the advisors filed out of the Oak Room, Charles remained seated at the head of the table, surrounded by the portraits of his predecessors. He thought about his mother, Elizabeth II, and the countless difficult decisions she had made during her long reign. She had always chosen duty over personal preference, and her unwavering commitment to constitutional principles had earned her unprecedented respect and longevity as monarch. The afternoon brought a series of routine engagements that felt anything but routine given the weight of the decision hanging over Charles's head. He opened a new hospital wing, met with Commonwealth representatives, and reviewed military honors, all while carrying the burden of knowing he would soon have to break his wife's heart. Palace staff began to notice subtle changes in the king's demeanor throughout the day. His usual warmth in public interactions remained, but those who knew him well detected an underlying tension. His private secretary rearranged several evening appointments, sensing that the king needed time to prepare for what would be one of the most difficult conversations of his reign. As evening approached, Charles made his final decision. He would not grant Camilla's request, and he would not offer the compromises they had discussed. The constitutional advice had been too clear, the risks too great, and the precedent too dangerous. The monarchy's survival depended on maintaining clear boundaries, and those boundaries could not be bent even for love. The decision brought him no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for what it would mean for Camilla and their relationship. He understood that this moment would fundamentally change their marriage, introducing a level of disappointment and perhaps resentment that might never fully heal. But he also understood that this was the price of monarchy, the sacrifice that came with wearing the crown. Charles spent the hour before dinner walking through the palace gardens, seeking solace among the roses that Camilla loved so much. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was surrounded by beautiful things that brought him no comfort, while preparing to deliver news that would wound the person he loved most in the world. The dinner was arranged in their private quarters, away from the formal dining rooms where state business was conducted. Charles wanted this conversation to be as intimate as possible, to emphasize that his decision came from his role as king rather than any lack of love for Camilla as his wife. When Camilla arrived, dressed elegantly but with eyes that showed she had spent the day hoping and worrying, Charles felt his resolve waver momentarily. She looked beautiful and vulnerable, carrying herself with the dignity that had won over so many skeptics through the years. She had sacrificed so much for their love, and now he was about to ask her to sacrifice even more. The conversation began gently, with Charles expressing his deep love and appreciation for everything Camilla had given up to be with him. He acknowledged the legitimacy of her desires and the worthiness of her family. He praised their discretion, their loyalty, and their potential contributions to royal service. But then came the words that would change everything between them. With the heavy authority of his office behind him, Charles explained that he could not grant her request. The constitutional implications were too serious, the risks too great, and the precedent too dangerous. As much as it pained him personally, his duty as king had to take precedence over his desires as a husband. Camilla's reaction was immediate and devastating. Years of contained disappointment came pouring out in a flood of emotion that surprised them both with its intensity. She had believed that their love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, that Charles's power as king would be sufficient to protect and honor her family. To learn that even the crown had limits when it came to her deepest desires felt like the ultimate betrayal. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had ever had. Camilla questioned not just the specific decision, but the entire structure of royal life that could demand such sacrifices. She spoke about the loneliness of her position, the isolation of being queen consort, but never being allowed to be fully herself. She challenged Charles to explain how a monarchy that couldn't embrace love and loyalty could claim to represent the values of modern Britain. Charles found himself defending not just his decision, but the entire constitutional framework of British monarchy. He explained the delicate balance between tradition and change, the careful management of public opinion, and the ultimate responsibility he bore for the institution's survival. His words were logical and well-reasoned, but they felt hollow against the raw emotion of Camilla's pain. As the evening progressed, both realized they were facing a crisis that went beyond the immediate issue of her family's recognition. They were confronting the fundamental tensions inherent in their relationship and their roles. Charles was simultaneously the man who loved her and the king who had to deny her deepest wishes. Camilla was both his devoted wife and a woman whose dreams were being sacrificed to constitutional necessity. The conversation ended without resolution, but with a new understanding of the limits that would always constrain their relationship. Charles had made his decision, and it was final. Camilla would have to accept that being queen consort came with restrictions that even love couldn't overcome. Their marriage would continue, but it would be forever changed by this moment of chosen duty over personal desire. The morning after Charles delivered his final decision dawned gray and cold over Buckingham Palace, matching the somber mood that had settled over the royal household. Word of the king's refusal had spread through the palace corridors with the efficiency that only decades of royal service could produce. Staff members who had grown to respect and admire the queen consort found themselves grappling with the implications of what they had witnessed. Margaret Thornton, Camilla's private secretary, arrived at her office to find a formal memorandum on her desk. The document, bearing the king's seal, outlined new protocols for managing requests related to the queen consort's family. The language was bureaucratic and cold, a stark contrast to the warm, collaborative atmosphere that had characterized their work together since the coronation. The memorandum made clear that there would be no official roles, no ceremonial positions, and no formal recognition for Camilla's children or former husband. More devastating still, it established new restrictions on their participation even in private royal events. The careful balance that had allowed for occasional family gatherings was being recalibrated to emphasize separation rather than integration. Margaret had served many members of the royal family throughout her career, but she had never witnessed anything quite like this. The decision represented not just a denial of Camilla's request, but a fundamental redrawing of the boundaries around the queen consort's personal life. It was as if the palace was creating a wall between Camilla's official duties and her private relationships, ensuring that the two could never meaningfully intersect. Senior palace officials gathered for their regular morning briefing, but the usual efficiency was replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Sir Clive Alderton led the meeting with his customary professionalism, but everyone could sense the undercurrents of shock and concern that rippled through the room. These were people who had dedicated their lives to serving the monarchy, and they understood better than anyone the significance of what had transpired. The master of the household, Vice Admiral Sir Tony Johnstone Bird, expressed concerns about the practical implications of the king's decision. Royal events had been carefully orchestrated to accommodate Camilla's family in subtle ways, and now those arrangements would need to be completely restructured. The logistics alone were daunting, but the emotional impact on staff who had grown fond of Tom and Laura was equally troubling. Lady Susan Hussey, one of the most senior members of the royal household and a woman who had witnessed decades of royal dramas, spoke with unusual directness about her concerns. She had watched Camilla transform from a controversial figure into a respected queen consort, and she feared that this decision could undo years of careful progress. The palace's relationship with the queen consort would inevitably be affected, and the ripple effects could extend far beyond this single issue. The discussion turned to public relations management, as the communications team grappled with how to explain what was happening without acknowledging the family tensions that were driving events. The official line would emphasize the king's commitment to constitutional propriety and the careful management of royal roles. But everyone in the room understood that the real story was far more personal and painful. Throughout the palace, individual staff members were processing the news in their own ways. The kitchen staff, who had grown accustomed to preparing meals that accommodated Tom's dietary preferences during family visits, found themselves wondering if they would ever see him again. The security team, who had developed protocols for protecting Camilla's grandchildren during palace visits, questioned whether those procedures would ever be needed again. In her private quarters, Camilla sat in the same chair where she had composed her hopeful letter just days earlier. The morning newspapers lay unopened on the table beside her, as she had no interest in the outside world's assessment of royal activities. Her focus was entirely internal, as she tried to process the magnitude of what Charles had done and what it meant for her future. The Queen Consort's day proceeded according to the schedule that had been set weeks earlier, but everything felt different now. Her first engagement was a visit to a literacy charity, where she was expected to appear cheerful and engaged while privately dealing with one of the most devastating disappointments of her life. The professional mask that royal training had taught her to wear felt heavier than ever. Staff members who accompanied Camilla to the charity event noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. While she maintained her public warmth and professionalism, there was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The spontaneous moments of genuine joy that had characterized her recent appearances seemed replaced by a more mechanical performance of royal duty. The charity workers and volunteers at the event sensed nothing amiss, praising the Queen Consort's knowledge and engagement with their programs. But her protection officers and private secretary could see the effort required to maintain that facade. Every smile was calculated, every response carefully modulated to project the appropriate royal image while concealing inner turmoil. Back at the palace, Charles was dealing with his own emotional aftermath. The king's official schedule proceeded normally, with meetings about Commonwealth affairs, reviews of legislative proposals, and discussions with government ministers. But those closest to him could see the weight he was carrying, the cost of the decision he had made for the sake of constitutional propriety. During a private moment between official meetings, Charles found himself in the blue drawing room, surrounded by portraits of previous monarchs who had faced their own impossible choices between personal desires and royal duty. He wondered if any of them had experienced the particular pain of denying someone they loved for the sake of an institution that sometimes seemed to demand the sacrifice of everything human and warm. The afternoon brought news that deepened the palace's sense of crisis. Tom Parker Bowles had canceled his participation in a cooking demonstration that was to benefit one of the king's charities. Laura Lopez had withdrawn from a children's event that she had been planning to attend as Camilla's guest. The ripple effects of Charles's decision were already extending beyond the immediate family to affect the charitable work that was central to royal purpose. More troubling still was word that Andrew Parker Bowles had declined an invitation to a military ceremony where his attendance had been anticipated for months. These withdrawals weren't dramatic gestures of protest, but quiet acknowledgments that the landscape had changed fundamentally. The careful web of relationships that had allowed Camilla's family to maintain a peripheral connection to royal life was unraveling. Staff members who had worked to facilitate these connections found themselves questioning their role in what felt like a betrayal of people they had grown to care about. The king's decision was certainly within his constitutional authority, but its human cost was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone who witnessed its implementation. As evening approached, the palace settled into a routine that felt brittle and uncertain. The usual rhythms of royal life continued, but with an undercurrent of tension that affected everything from formal dinner arrangements to casual conversations among staff members. The decision had created a new reality that everyone was still learning to navigate. The most difficult moment came when Camilla's grandchildren, who had been scheduled to visit that weekend for an early celebration of one of their birthdays, were quietly uninvited through a message from their parents. The children wouldn't understand why their grandmother's home was suddenly off-limits, and the staff who had been preparing special activities for their visit felt the particular sadness of disappointed children. In the king's private study that evening, Charles sat alone with documents spread before him, but his concentration was entirely elsewhere. He had made the decision that his constitutional advisors deemed necessary, but the human cost was proving higher than even he had anticipated. The monarchy would continue, its protocols intact and its constitutional position secure, but at a price that felt almost unbearable. The palace's evening routine proceeded with mechanical efficiency, but everyone involved understood that something fundamental had changed. The decision to exclude Camilla's family hadn't just affected the individuals involved. It had created a new understanding of the limits and costs of royal life that would influence every subsequent decision. As lights dimmed throughout the palace, staff members returned to their quarters carrying the weight of what they had witnessed. They had seen a king choose duty over love, protocol over human connection, and constitutional propriety over personal happiness. The monarchy would survive this decision, as it had survived countless others throughout history. But the human cost had left everyone involved forever changed. 6 months had passed since that devastating evening when Charles delivered his final decision, and the palace had settled into a new rhythm that everyone was still learning to navigate. The initial shock had given way to a complex understanding of how the royal family would function under these new constraints, but the emotional wounds remained tender for everyone involved. Camilla had transformed in ways that surprised even those who knew her best. The woman who had once approached her royal duties with evident joy and enthusiasm now carried herself with a different kind of dignity. Her public appearances remained flawless, her charitable work continued to expand and deepen, but there was a steel in her demeanor that hadn't existed before. She had learned to compartmentalize her personal disappointments and channel them into a fierce dedication to her official role. The queen consort's relationship with Charles had evolved into something more complex and nuanced than their earlier romantic partnership. They maintained their public unity and private affection, but conversations that once flowed easily now required more careful navigation. The decision had created a boundary in their marriage that both acknowledged but neither discussed directly. They loved each other still, but that love now existed within clearly defined constitutional limits. Staff members had watched this evolution with a mixture of admiration and sadness. Camilla's transformation into a more distant, more formally royal figure had been necessary for her survival in the role, but it had cost something essential about her personality that had made her so appealing to work with. The spontaneous warmth and maternal inclusiveness that had characterized her early months as queen consort had been replaced by a more measured, professional approach to everything. The impact on her family had been profound and lasting. Tom Parker Bowles had thrown himself into his culinary career with renewed intensity, but those close to him noticed a bitter edge to his humor that hadn't been there before. He spoke less frequently with his mother, not out of anger, but because conversations inevitably touched on the gulf that now existed between her life and his. The Sunday lunches and casual phone calls that had sustained their relationship for decades became stilted and infrequent. Laura Lopez had withdrawn almost entirely from anything connected to royal life. She focused on her children and her private charitable work, building a life that existed completely separate from the palace. Her decision was protective rather than vindictive, but it meant that Camilla's grandchildren grew up with an even more distant understanding of their grandmother's role. The palace visits that had once been special treats became memories rather than ongoing experiences. Perhaps most poignantly, Andrew Parker Bowles had quietly faded from the periphery of royal events where his presence had once been tolerated and even welcomed. His dignified withdrawal spoke volumes about his understanding of the new reality. The man who had graciously attended his ex-wife's wedding to the king now understood that such gestures of family unity were no longer possible or desired. The broader palace community had also been changed by these events. Senior staff members who had worked for decades to facilitate relationships and manage complex family dynamics found themselves implementing policies that felt contrary to their instincts about human kindness and inclusion. The king's decision had been constitutionally correct, but its implementation required everyone to participate in what felt like an ongoing act of exclusion. Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, had become particularly skilled at managing the practical implications of the new arrangements. His office developed protocols for handling family-related requests and inquiries that maintained the formal distance Charles had decreed while avoiding unnecessarily cruel rejections. The bureaucratic machinery of exclusion operated with efficient politeness, but everyone involved understood its essential coldness. The public remained largely unaware of the family tensions playing out behind palace walls. Official statements emphasized the king and queen consort's commitment to their constitutional roles and their focus on serving the British people. The careful management of public appearances meant that Charles and Camilla continued to project unity and purpose, even as their private lives had been fundamentally restructured. Royal correspondents occasionally noted the absence of Camilla's family members from events where they might previously have been included, but these observations were treated as routine adjustments rather than signs of deeper conflicts. The palace's communication strategy successfully maintained the fiction that nothing significant had changed, while ensuring that expectations about family inclusion were quietly lowered. Behind the scenes, however, the decision continued to create ripple effects that touched every aspect of royal operations. Event planning became more complex as organizers had to ensure that no situations arose that might highlight the exclusion of Camilla's family. Gift policies were revised to avoid any appearance of extending royal favor to non-official family members. Even routine charitable partnerships required additional scrutiny to ensure they didn't create opportunities for uncomfortable family encounters. The king himself bore the weight of these complications with stoic determination, but close observers could see the toll it took on him. Charles had always prided himself on his ability to modernize the monarchy while respecting its traditions, but this decision felt like a step backward toward the rigid exclusiveness that had characterized royal life in earlier eras. The progressive vision he had articulated before becoming king seemed more difficult to achieve when it conflicted with constitutional necessities. As the first anniversary of his controversial decision approached, Charles found himself reflecting on its long-term implications. The monarchy had indeed emerged stronger in constitutional terms, with clearer boundaries and more defensible protocols around family inclusion. Public polling showed continued support for the royal family and particular appreciation for the queen consort's dedicated service. From an institutional perspective, the decision had been vindicated, but the personal costs remained difficult to accept. Charles had gained a deeper understanding of the loneliness inherent in his role, the way that constitutional requirements could isolate him even from those he loved most. The crown that had brought him ultimate authority had also created distances that couldn't be bridged by love or good intentions. Every monarch learned this lesson, but experiencing it firsthand was more painful than he had anticipated. Camilla's adaptation to her constrained circumstances had been remarkable to witness. She had become more royal in the traditional sense, more distant and formal, but also more effective in her official role. Her charitable work had expanded significantly, her public speaking had improved markedly, and her understanding of constitutional protocols had deepened considerably. The disappointed wife had evolved into a more impressive queen consort, though at a cost that only she fully understood. The transformation had affected their marriage in subtle but significant ways. Conversations that once ranged freely over personal and official topics now required more careful consideration of which subjects were safe to explore. The easy intimacy that had sustained them through decades of controversy had been complicated by the reality that Charles's role as king sometimes required him to deny Camilla's most fundamental desires. Yet their relationship had also developed new strengths. They had navigated the most serious constitutional crisis of their marriage, and emerged with their partnership intact. Camilla's acceptance of the limitations imposed by royal life had removed a source of ongoing tension, even as it had created new distances. Charles's willingness to enforce those limitations, despite their personal cost, had demonstrated his commitment to constitutional monarchy even when it conflicted with his desires as a husband. The palace staff had learned to work within the new reality with professional efficiency, but many carried a sense of sadness about what had been lost. The more inclusive, warmer atmosphere that Camilla had initially brought to royal life had been replaced by something more traditionally formal. The change wasn't necessarily wrong, but it represented the sacrifice of possibilities that had seemed within reach just months earlier. As this chapter of royal history moved toward its conclusion, everyone involved understood that they had participated in something significant. The king's decision to refuse his wife's request for family inclusion had clarified important constitutional principles and established precedents that would guide future monarchs. But it had also demonstrated the ongoing tension between the monarchy's human elements and its institutional requirements. The story would continue, with Charles and Camilla finding new ways to balance their personal relationship with their public roles. The monarchy would evolve and adapt, as it always had, learning from each crisis and adjustment. But for those who witnessed this particular moment of choice between love and duty, the memory of what was sacrificed in service of constitutional propriety would remain a reminder of both the power and the costs of wearing the crown.